based on Romans 8:28. The hope we have as we experience the most adverse circumstances or going through the most severe trials is knowing that God's in control. That He is not only just in control, but He is the sovereign creator. Now that also means that we need to understand that He permits or sends affliction our ways at times. It's not all what we would consider good stuff. There are times that He sends afflictions our ways too. Because quite honestly, we wouldn't turn to God and seek God out if everything was simple and easy. If it all went our way, I wouldn't. I would not turn to God and seek God out if everything went my way all the time. You know what would happen? I would start relying on myself instead of God. I would seek out my own counsel and my own direction of things. We also need to recognize that while God may permit or send affliction our ways, He also will overrule difficult times and afflictions that we face us. He may overrule those things and say, that's enough. That's enough. It's time for rest. It's time for peace. Now, understand something. We can have absolute peace in God even in the most difficult times. Even in the most difficult times, we can have absolute peace with God. You believe me? Huh?
Amen.
Now, do you really believe me?
Amen.
That's it. I can't see who you were, but I appreciate it anyway. So God permits afflictions. God permits difficult times. He may send them our way for us to learn. He will overrule difficult times. I mean, He is sovereign. He is the creator of all. But He also sets each of us that love Him apart from the world. Remember in John 17, Jesus prayed that magnificent prayer before He went to the cross. And He asked God, He said, sanctify them with your truth, or with your word. For your word is truth. He sets each of us apart. And being set apart by God, we can have the confidence of knowing. Listen to me on this. Being set apart by God, we can have the confidence of knowing that everything that we face in life is for our good. There's no reason for us to mumble and grumble or gripe and complain. There's absolutely no reason for it. Let me share this story with you. You know, I truly enjoy sharing with you how God works in mine and Robin's life at times. And they called this week to schedule my eye surgeries. And so we got those scheduled, and I was on the phone with the girl, and she hung up on me accidentally. And she called me back and was very apologetic, and I got to reassure her and let her know that things were fine. But here's the cool part. Robin and I have been having to drive to Louisville to meet with the eye surgeon and with the other eye doctor that's giving me injections for retinopathy. Well, in the process of all of this, and this girl that's the scheduler working on being helpful with the scheduling, she asked me, she says, Mr. O'Brien, why do you drive to Louisville? And I said, well, we were told we had to because of Medicare. And she says, oh no, you were told wrong. You could drive right over to Florence. And we're all chuckling and laughing. And I was excited because that meant no more all-day trips to Louisville and back. But here's the cool thing. I got to share Christ with people in that office in Louisville that I would not have never been able to do otherwise. I got to reassure them of me being okay with the eye surgeries and that I wasn't concerned about it. So, we need to begin to look at, all of us should begin to look at, even in the midst of our inconveniences, even in the midst of our trials and troubles, we can be confident that God has it under control. There is nothing that should be more desirable for us than God working in our lives. Absolutely nothing. We should burn with that desire, that hunger of God working in our lives each and every day. Let's face it, we are God's workmanship. Ephesians 2:10 makes that very clear, that we are God's workmanship. We are the one that God is molding and shaping. David recognized this in Psalm 139. And he prayed and he said, search me out, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties. And see if there's any wicked thing in me, and lead me in a path everlasting. David knew and desired God's absolute control over his life. Probably one of the greatest examples that I believe is a picture of God in Job's life and his sovereignty. Turn to Job chapter 38. In my studies, I learned of a Puritan pastor who preached on Job. Preached on Job in England for so long, he spent 22 years teaching in the book of Job. Now, his congregation fell off in the process of that. I have to admit, I'm not sure that I could preach 22 years in the book of Job. I'm not sure that you could sit here and listen to 22 years of the book of Job. But we're going to look today because it is exciting. I mean, not everything that happened to Job was exciting. Please don't misunderstand me. Here Job was, one of the wealthiest men in the land. Thousands of sheep, goats, cattle. At the end of Job, it actually tells you how many God restored to Job. Rick, if I had 1,000 thoroughbred horses, that'd be worth a little bit of money, wouldn't it?
Depends on what they were.
Well, I can always rely on Rick to put a downer to my point that I'm making. But Job was a wealthy man. Job, from everything in the book of Job, trusted God, honored God. But then Satan came along and put down a challenge to God. Now understand something at this point. This was between God and Satan. God did not go to Job and talk to Job about it. He didn't call Job on the phone or send a messenger to Job and say, I want to meet with you, Job. And God said, come on over here, Job. Let's sit down and talk for a minute. Let's sit down here and talk. I want to talk to you about what's going to happen to you. I want to make sure you're okay with it. No, God didn't do that at all. Satan went to God and he said, I'll bet that if I start taking stuff away from Job, he's going to turn his back on you. Because the only reason that he loves you, the only reason that he obeys you is because all the stuff you're giving him. Now, God knew going in what the outcome was going to be. Please understand that. That is one of the magnificent things about God, is God knows beforehand what the outcome's going to be. When any of us are going through a trial or a trouble, when any of us are experiencing pressures in our lives, God knows what the outcome's going to be going in. He knows going in what it's going to be. He knows that He is not going to put on you more than you can handle. Where is it in Corinthians? That God said, there is therefore now no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, that He will not suffer you to be tempted beyond that which you are able. God's not going to put anything in your life that He is not prepared you for, or that He is not provided for how you're going to deal with this. So Job became the victim of Satan's attempts to prove God wrong. And in the process of this, Job lost his wealth. Job lost his family. Job lost his health. One commentator said he lost everything but his wife, and given some of the comments that his wife made in Job, he might have been better off losing his wife too. I mean, since his wife was telling him that he ought to just go on and kill himself, get it over with. That's not very encouraging. So, we're coming to the end of this event of Job. And it's important for us to read a couple of things here. And we're going to look at Job up through almost the complete end of the book of Job. In Job 38, and we're going to start reading in verse 1. It says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now this whirlwind is thought to have been a storm that was coming up. Elihu, who was speaking in chapters 36 and 37, was giving Job this religious encouragement. And I say religious encouragement because it wasn't a lifting up and an edifying of Job. It was a tearing down of Job. But apparently there was a storm coming up, and Elihu, rather than sticking with Job, left. And left Job all alone. So God spoke out of this whirlwind and said, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now I want to stop right there and I want to point something out. God's confronting Job because of what Job was saying that he knew nothing of, and of what Elihu was saying that he knew nothing of. That phrase, by words without knowledge, literally, God is saying, you are sinning against me because you are speaking out against me. Anytime we begin to talk about what God is doing in our lives, having no understanding of what God is really doing in our lives, we're in sin. Did you ever think about that? Did you ever think about that? God just doesn't love me anymore. I've done something in my life that God is just punishing me. God's abandoned me. Anybody ever felt that way besides me? You're allowed to raise your hands up. Boy, I have. And you see, it's sin. It's sin. Just plain and simple sin. And God's confronting Job and saying, why are you sinning against me? In verse 3 he says, now prepare yourself like a man. In other words, gird yourself up. Get yourself ready for battle. And then he says this, I will question you and you shall answer me. In other words, God's saying, all right, Job, you've been mouthing. See, Job never turned his back on God, but that doesn't mean Job didn't complain. That doesn't mean that Job did not mumble and grumble. And God's saying, okay, here it is. You're going to own your life. You're going to own the words that you're saying. Get ready to answer me. Anybody mumble and grumble about their life besides me? We all know that's sin, don't we? Don't we? Boy, that's quiet. We don't like to admit, folks, we don't like to admit when sin is in our life, but we need to understand this. The reason we cannot get excited about, for we know all things work together for good, we stop there because that little space that has such huge meaning when we say, for we know that all things work, and we stop. For good. We need to understand the fact that everything that comes into our life, God has a plan and a purpose for it, and we are sinning when we are complaining against God or trying to speak out and explain something about God's plan that we don't know anything about. And as a result of that sin, we are not able to comprehend the vastness of God saying, everything in your life, the trials, the troubles, the pressures, the sickness, everything has a purpose. And I've got your back. I'm going to walk through it with you. The reason we can't get excited about it is because we're not grasping that. So God says to Job, I'm going to question you, and you're going to answer me. When I read this years ago for the first time, I thought about getting called into the boss's office and getting called on the carpet. Anybody ever experienced that besides me? I'm sure many of you have from the chuckles. Verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me. If you have understanding, see, there's that question. If you've got understanding about this, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? You think you know what's going on here. John, you think you know what's going on in your life? You think you know what I'm doing? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? You get where I'm going on this? This isn't me saying this. This is God saying this. And he goes on and he says, who determined its measure or its size? Surely you know. You could write out beside that, God's being sarcastic. Because he looked at Job and he's saying, surely you know about the vastness of creation. I'm pretty confident you know all about that. Or who stretched the line upon it? Who set its boundaries? Who set its measurements? Verse 6, to what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstones? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the seas with doors, when it bursts forth and issues from the womb, when I made the clouds its garments, and thick darkness its swaddling hand. Man, what a picture of creation. And God basically is saying at this point, where were you when all this took place? Where were you when all this took place? Miss Alberta, I'm going to apologize ahead of time for what I'm going to ask you. Where were you when you fell a few years back and broke your ankle? Well, that's a great answer. Because God had a plan and purpose for it. I'll tell you, one of the plans and purpose for it is that we became closer to you. I became closer to you.
I fell down the church steps.
Yeah.
There's the body. Broke her off.
Did you know what God had planned for you after that? I'll answer for you. No. None of us did. Do you all follow where I'm going with this? We have things that happen in our lives, many times what we would define as horrific things happen in our lives. But friends, let me ask you a question. Are those things really horrific if God's in control of it? What makes them horrific? Huh? Us, we do. We make them horrific because we have no understanding. We make them horrific because we're so busy asking why rather than saying, God, we want to glorify you in this. Praise God for it. Say, well, that's a whole different way of looking at this. Yes, it is. I'm not sure that I like this. I don't either. But it's important to understand, if we want to benefit in walking in God's grace and the fullness of God's grace based on the fact that He has everything under control, that all things work together for good, if we want to be able to benefit from that, we need to recognize all this other. We need to recognize that. Now, I'm not going to read all through the rest of Job here. Flip over a couple of pages to Job chapter 40. God's still talking with Job here at this point. Job chapter 40 verse 1. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? That phrase contend there is the same contend phrasing that's in Psalm 46:10. Be still and know God. Stop contending and know God. Same phrase. Same Hebrew phrasing that is used. And God asked Job here, He says, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Have you ever stopped to think about the fact that there are times when we are mumbling and grumbling about what is happening in our lives, that we literally are attempting to correct God? Do you ever think about that? Rather than looking at God and going to Him and saying, God, I don't like it. I don't understand it. I'm not sure. In fact, I know, God, in my own self, I can't handle it. But I know you have a plan and a purpose Praise God, I know that all things work together for good to them that love God. Stop right there, and we're going to talk about this next week. There are two conditions stated in Romans 8:28. There are two conditions that we tend to overlook, and we're going to begin looking at this next week. When it comes to being able to claim this promise of all things work together for good. Anybody want to guess what the first one is? Those that love God. Those that love God. That's condition number one. If you are not loving God, how can you be at a place of reassurance that all things work together for good? If you're loving God, if you and I are loving God, how are we contending with God and correcting Him? Now, please understand, I'm not saying that if we contend with God that we're not saved. That's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. But there are so many times in life that God dishes out to us in order for us to learn and grow spiritually. And we don't like it, do we? We don't want it to happen, do we? Let's put it real simple for a minute. It's just hypothetical. Let's say you're having a hard time managing your money. You're not a good manager of money. You don't budget your money well. You're kind of an impulse buyer. And all of a sudden, money starts getting tight. And you're forced to manage your money well. You're forced to live in a budget. You're forced to not buy things on impulse. You're forced to think through it. And all of a sudden, you begin to pray to God and ask God about what you're supposed to do about managing your money. How do you manage your money? All of a sudden, things change. All things work together for good because now you're learning about managing your money. God is walking you through it in the process of making a change in your life. Folks, there are days and times that if we don't go through the hard stuff, we're not going to make changes in our lives. If we don't go through difficult challenges, we are not going to grow spiritually.